Hello everybody. I'm not sure whether to say good morning or good evening, given we have lots of people listening in from both the UK and also from Australia. This is the HEPI JMI webinar on the Universities Accord process in Australia, a really, really major review of higher education in Australia, for which there is huge interest in the UK, particularly because of the point we're at in the political cycle and the likelihood of a change of government who may or may not want to copy the Australian Universities Accord, which was put in place by an Australian Labor government, but is obviously an independent review. So the way the morning's going to work, my name's Nick Hillman, for those of you who don't know me, and I head up HEPI, which is an Oxford-based think tank here in the UK. And I'm just going to show just a couple of slides to explain how the morning's going to go. You can see all my emails there. Here we go. So the theme of this morning is the Australian review. I'm just trying to minimize things on my screen. There are, it was interesting, when the Australian Accord was published, I was in communication with a chap whose office is just around the corner from where I'm sitting, Simon Marginson, who's very well known in Australia and the UK. And his assessment of the Accord, which I think is a useful reminder at the beginning, is that it really is a trailblazing document. He called it very good, policy practical. He said the world would be better if the Accord's many recommendations, which we'll hear about in a moment, were implemented, and many of them are being implemented, is my understanding. And he said, if only the UK policy world could generate such a vision and make it practical, then many of the challenges facing UK higher education could be usefully tackled. There is a different view. Mary O'Kane, who headed up the review that we're about to hear from, doesn't know I was going to show this, but there is a different view, which was articulated in a HEPI blog by Andrew Norton, and it's actually, I've got to say, based on the interim findings, not the final findings. And he was more critical. He said there's some targets that he doesn't think will be hit, that the terms of reference were too wide from the outset, that there could be something to upset every stakeholder as well as something to please every stakeholder. So there is an alternative view. And I think one thing we could very usefully cover this morning is whether the process is a useful model for other countries or not. Most people seem to think it is, but not, as Andrew's comments there suggest, not absolutely everybody. So the format for this morning is, first we're going to hear from Professor Mary O'Kane, former Vice-Chancellor, who chaired the panel, and she's going to explain the findings, the process, and anything else she thinks we should usefully know about it. Then we're going to hear from Libby Hackett, CEO of our co-sponsors of this morning's programme, the James Martin Institute. Libby used to work for HEPI, my organisation, the Higher Education Policy Institute, about 20 years ago, and in April 2014 published a paper comparing the UK and Australian university funding systems, which remains a live issue. Then we're going to hear from Duncan Ivison, who is Deputy VC, was Deputy VC at the University of Sydney, and is becoming equally well known over here in the UK as the incoming President and Vice-Chancellor of the University of Manchester. I should declare an interest because I'm on the board of the University of Manchester, though I wasn't deeply involved in that recruitment process. Then we're going to hear from Professor Andy Westwood, who's also from the University of Manchester, but as well as that, a former special advisor to one of the last Labour ministers for universities policy here in the UK, John Denham, so has deep experience in Whitehall as well. And then we're going to hopefully, if all our speakers kindly stick to time, have plenty of time for questions and answers. So do please put your questions in the box, the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom thing, and do upvote other people's questions, because the questions that I will put to the panel will be the ones at or near the top of the list. And we'll even ask you to, we'll even try and get your microphones turned on so that you can ask your own questions. You can table your questions anonymously if you want to, but if you put your name there, we'll try and get you to ask your own questions, because I think that's always more interactive and better. We've got a hard cut-off at 10:15. Just the final word, this is being recorded. We hope to make it available on our YouTube channel. So please bear in mind that your comments are on the record and could be quoted by others. I hope that won't limit what anyone says, but I don't want that to be a surprise. So, Mary, you're in Sydney, as is Libby, as is Duncan. Can I turn to you first?
Thank you very much, and thank you for putting this on, Nick. The Universities Accord was a promise of the current Labor government when it came into government, though there was a change of higher education minister. The shadow minister did not transit, but the new minister took it on very enthusiastically. We worked for 13 and a half months and delivered slightly early, about 3 days early. We had the terms of reference were not about fixing a broken system. They were very much about dealing with some particular national needs for Australia. And I talk about them in two parts: output terms of reference and process terms of reference. The outputs were, it talked about meeting the skills needs for Australia up to 2050, for trying to get more of equity students from equity backgrounds into higher education, at least into tertiary education, and how we made use of knowledge generated in the higher education system. And that's been an ongoing problem in Australia. The support terms of reference were very much about all the things you would expect about funding, governance, regulation, and so on. And so I'll talk about the two sets in different ways. We came out with 47 recommendations, which I don't think is a lot for a very big piece of work, but there's a lot of jokes running around in Australia about all 47. As it turns out, in the recent budget brought down by government, the government has adopted 29 of the recommendations in full or in part, and has indicated in slightly general terms that they intend to adopt the rest with the exception of one. And so that's pleasing. They have said that they're taking a multi-year approach to it. And so some of the things they announced in this budget were for immediate implementation, and some are out in the out years, and some are signalled for further out still. Will they get adopted if there is another change of government? We'll wait and see. The panel was an interesting one. It consisted of two former ministers, one from each side of politics, a current Vice-Chancellor, Barney Glover, who was Vice-Chancellor of Western Sydney, currently the National Jobs and Skills Commissioner, Larissa Berendt, who'd done the Berendt Review of Indigenous First Nations higher ed in about 2013, 14, somewhere there, and Ben Rimmer, the Deputy Secretary of the Department of Education. We consulted very widely. We brought out a discussion paper, an interim report, and a final report. And the interim report had a small number of 5 recommendations, mainly going to student safety issues and to university governance. So I want to now quickly go through the main sort of headline points of the review, and then we'll happily answer questions now and even after this thing. First of all, I want to talk about recommendation 1, and no, I'm not going to go through all 47. But recommendation 1 was that there be a national tertiary education objective. In Australia, in our energy system, in our central banking system, we have objectives which are statements that any new policy proposal in those areas needs to be tested against. So the one that's proposed for higher education is that the national tertiary education system should A, underpin a strong, equitable and resilient democracy, and B, drive national economic and social development and environmental sustainability. So it's proposed that that be, so that's the sort of big setting. The next big issue that I want to talk to is the skills issue, and that's a very dominant part of the accord. And we modelled what was needed from the skills projections to 2050, and it would show we'd have to double the higher education system in terms of size. And that's a challenge here because the entry to universities is soft at the moment. And while it, you know, in different economic times could be sort of sharper, it does show that there is a challenge here. And we worked out in modelling, looking at the equity groups, and the equity groups are low SES, rural and remote, disabled, First Nations, and smaller equity groups such as refugees, care leavers, and so on, that if you get those numbers to population parity, you could actually, for higher education, you could actually meet your skills needs. So the tagline of the whole review is like a horse name. It's skills through equity. In looking at the skills issue, we also looked at what would make the whole issue of rapid adoption of new disciplines easier, what would meet the big employer demand for high performance in generic skills, and so on. And we make a series of recommendations about structures in that regard. In particular, we were asked to look at the links between university education and vocational education and training, the VET system. And we recommend that these two systems be very strongly linked and talk more generally about tertiary education as covering both systems. We also put a lot of emphasis on what we call skills infrastructure, which has bugged the Australian system for the last 40 years or so, where we've talked about getting integration between the vocational and the higher education systems and getting seamless structures, but we haven't done it. So we call in the skills infrastructure for things such as the National Skills Passport, the review of the Australian Qualifications Framework, a national skills taxonomy, data standards to support all this. And a real bugbear for all of us is the recognition of prior learning, which we've talked about but have never done very well. Early exit and articulation pathways, so students can leave with some sort of qualification, even if they leave after, say, 2 years. And to talk in particular about work integrated learning, particularly for educating the professions. And that proved a really big issue because of what we call placement poverty here in Australia, where students can't even afford to do their mandated placement to get their qualifications in various professions. And so the government has taken up our recommendations and is actually paying students who are below the poverty line to do their placement. We should mention too that we've recommended there be a code of conduct for professional bodies so that they can't hold a gun at the head of the universities, if you like, and that they will meet needs of what it's needed to deliver skills in their particular professional area. I want to move now to the next big pillar, which is equity. While there's a lot on the equity thing, the main points are these. We want to aim for population parity by 2035, that the equity groups are represented at the appropriate levels. And we say that for equity students to succeed, you need to address 4 major issues. One is aspiration. Unless you can get kids interested in going to university, preferably when they're little more than toddlers, and certainly when they're going through school, we've found they won't go. So the whole education system has to work on aspiration. The second main thing is preparation for entry. Many students, whether they're from equity groups or from others, fall out of school and often have trouble getting back in and getting a toehold into tertiary or higher education. And so the government in the budget has picked up our recommendations there and has introduced a thing called fee-free uni ready, which is somewhat hard to say, but it will allow people to get a second chance and to be able to get some credit in higher education and to be able to enter very easily. The third one, in scaffolded support for learning, because equity groups typically fall away in the first 2 years of higher education. So we recommend that be picked up, and we talk about needs-based funding in the funding system. Libby might talk about this in a little while. And that's something the government has signalled it's going to adopt. And the fourth one is to remove a range of roadblocks that make it hard. In that context, we particularly talk about the needs of students. And we talk about the need to fix the student income support system, which is not under the Department of Education, it's more under the Social Security Department. But we think unless that's done, it's hard, particularly for these equity groups, to get through. We also recommend the reversal of the Jobs Ready graduate program introduced by the previous government, which was an incentive structure involving the higher education contribution scheme to try and get people out of the humanities and into other fields. It spectacularly didn't work, and it's needed to reverse it, but it's very, very expensive to reverse. We also recommended that the higher education contribution scheme be looked at in various ways, including about the indexation arrangements, and that has been picked. The indexation arrangements were picked up in the recent budget. We also addressed student safety on campus issues. That's really been quite a problem. We were horrified to discover what an issue that was. We also recommend a racism survey. Going back briefly on the skills front, when the with the higher education system expanding to 2050, there'll also be a great expansion in staff, in academic and professional staff. And we think that appropriate training for people in both education and research is very necessary and something that needs to be considered in detail. We also made some recommendations about international education. They're not the ones that the government has implemented, but they were along those lines in a softer form. And I'll answer questions on it, but leave it there. The third big pillar, of course, as I said, is new knowledge and research. And the issue in Australia is a peculiar one, where the private sector is not investing heavily in research at the moment, and the government sector is fairly flat. The big investors for their size are the universities, which fund 36% of Australia's R&D expenditure, which is $12.7 billion per annum. And we have very good quality research in terms of international co-publication and impact and academic impact by various measures. But Australia is very weak in terms of innovation indices. And one of the issues is, how do we use this great research capacity we have to actually solve real world problems? And that's something this Labor government is very keen on. And so the recommendations on research go particularly to keeping this really high quality going, while at the same time getting government and industry to appreciate the incredible powerhouse that exists in the research side, and also to understand the value of research training to the level of the PhD and have a lot more people from industry come through. We also put a lot of emphasis on supporting First Nations in getting stronger research performance and using First Nations knowledges. Again, happy to answer questions on this in detail, but these recommendations have only one, the first one, the one to have yet another review of all of R&D funding by the Australian government has been implemented. But there's enthusiasm from the Business Council of Australia and others to implement several of the others, including a strategic fund to reward universities for ones that allow their research ability to be picked up on real world problems. I'll just very quickly talk on the supporting structures. The first one, system governance. We're recommending the creation, or actually the recreation, of an Australian Tertiary Education Commission. We had one from 1944 to 1988 under various reincarnations through it, but we think it's time to have it again, to have a commission that understands the system, is with the commissioners being primarily drawn from the sector, and that it really be the brains of the system. It also that it works well in partnership with the system. So if you like, the heart of the system, as well as pushing hard for the system and supporting it, if you like, the guts. The commission, we believe, should be in charge of policy coordination, planning. The system is totally unplanned at the moment. It just runs in reaction to incentives. That it looked to negotiating the mission-based compacts we think should be retained. We also, and this is, as I said, I'll leave to Libby, but strongly recommend a change to the funding arrangements and the introduction, stolen from the health system in Australia, of a pricing authority idea, where we can really understand the true cost of different courses and get the full funding of research into place, because we don't go anywhere near the full economic cost, and we need to move towards that. And so a pricing authority which manages the cost structures is an important part of what we're suggesting. We also recommend that it have the accountability, regulatory and data structures that are needed, but it do that in a harmonious and low administrative way with the higher education system. We're hoping that out of all of that governance and pricing arrangements, that we'll get a much more diverse system and not as many gigantic universities. The way we're proposing to get rid of marginal funding, and that this is really important because at the moment the system has been built on marginal funding, and it's one of the reasons the system grows so much in terms of these monster universities. We're hoping to get smaller universities, a more diverse arrangement, and some universities doing different things, some emphasising teaching more, some emphasising research, new big research impact universities in the poorest suburbs, a whole set of things of that kind. We also talk a fair bit about regional universities, since the regions are a big part of Australia, and talk about the importance of certain disciplines, notably the health disciplines, being medicine and the allied health disciplines being supported in the regions, as we find people will stay if they are educated more or less at home. We also have another very useful thing in the regions called study hubs, which was introduced by the previous government and enthusiastically endorsed by us and taken up by this government to help people who can't travel to a university for their first year of university, but can do it remotely in a place they go to study with others, doing things at other universities. And with that, I think, Nick, I will leave it. The last thing to say is that the government has appointed a implementation working group, and that we should expect some more announcements over the next few months as that working group delivers what it decides on the recommendations.
Well, thank you so much, Mary. That was a brilliantly brief review of the very wide-ranging report that you produced. And I don't know if people in Australia recognise just how relevant nearly all of your 47 recommendations are to the debate here, though I'm sure Duncan and Andy may want to touch upon that. So with no further ado, other than to say, do keep the questions coming in. There are already some very interesting questions in the Q&A, which we'll put to the panel after we've heard from them all. I'm going to go straight to literally your neighbour sitting next to you, Libby, a comment from the James Martin Institute.
Thanks, Nick. And thank you, Mary. Fantastic tour de force of a brilliant report. I just wanted, so there's three things I want to flag, and I'll try and be brief. I want to talk about the message or mission of the Accord, particularly around this idea of equity for growth. I want to talk a little bit about research, and I want to talk about the Tertiary Education Commission. For me, these are areas that connect really well into UK higher ed policy right now. As Nick mentioned, I did work at HEPI. I also worked at HEPI and at the Russell Group and University Alliance at various points. I've been in Australia for nearly 10 years now, and heading up the James Martin Institute for Public Policy, which is a unique joint venture between government and universities around this shared mission of solving real world problems. Exactly as Mary said, it's a public policy institute, so we do that in relation to supporting government with these big public policy issues they're tackling. But it has been a privilege to see that sort of collaborative approach come through the institute. The three things I'd love to flag: firstly, the message or the mission of the Accord. Even the fact that it's called an accord, I think it's worth pausing on that for a moment, and all credit to Jason, Claire and Mary and others. An accord is an agreement between two sides, in this example, between government and universities. Right from the get-go, the government set this out as a collaborative model, as an engagement of partnership, that it was positive, it was constructive in tone. And to give all due credit to Mary and the panel, they managed to maintain that positive, constructive tone and engagement. It very much felt like a partnership and a collaborative approach across the sector, with the sector leaning in, which was fantastic to see. The government could have done an independent review or a government review or an inquiry, the very formal type of thing. They chose to do this as an accord, and I think we should acknowledge that. And then through that, there was this unifying message. So again, right from the start, the Minister, Jason Clare, put out this message around equity for growth. And it created this consistent focus for government and the sector, and created a sort of shared mission that everyone could get behind around this really optimistic message of growth for the economy, but the close relationship of that to equity as well. So yes, we have this new target of 80% of the workforce having a tertiary education qualification. Of course, that's not just a degree, that's higher education and VET, or in UK terms, higher ed and FE, but a post-school qualification. How interesting, how exciting to smash through that 50% rhetoric of, you know, who deserves to have a degree, who should go to university. Surely we've got too many graduates in our economy. We've got graduates with reducing return and going into non-graduate jobs. Nonsense, nonsense. We smashed through this with a positive, optimistic message based on evidence. This is a very strongly evidence-based position on future skills needs for the Australian economy. In the early report, it talked about evidence from the Jobs and Skills Australia, saying that 90% of newly created jobs in Australia over the next decade would require a tertiary education qualification. Now, this evidence is not new. 10 years ago, 15 years ago in the UK, we were talking about 8 out of 10 jobs needing a tertiary education qualification, and newly created jobs over the next decade. But what the Australian minister and the new Labour government did was to take that evidence and turn it into a really positive narrative around this future economic vision around growth. And where they did something even smarter was then to tie this to equity targets, because not only did it give the government the moral high ground, because it's very hard to argue with these equity targets, both in Australia and the UK, but actually the evidence base, again, is so clear of the link and the codependency between growth and equity in our system. You cannot grow the Australian system, and dare I say the UK system, without reaching more of those equity targets that we're all aiming for, and vice versa. It's incredibly difficult to reach those equity targets unless you're in a growing system. These are deeply interconnected. There's no pool of unmet demand in Australia or in the UK, and therefore growing the system is about raising aspiration, raising access, raising participation in higher education. Now, this agenda, widening participation, social mobility, equity, it's been a big agenda in the UK for many decades, but often through a negative lens, often through the government setting equity goals and the universities failing to meet them. So it becomes a sort of critical lens on UK universities. What the Accord did that was so fundamentally different was to make it a shared responsibility of government and universities to aim towards these growth and equity targets. How different, how interesting. And we saw this sort of shared mission approach come together right from the start. And the minister talking early on about how if this growth, if these equity goals were going to be met, it was right down into the early year and school system, exactly as Mary said. Okay, so then a question emerges. If we're going to double the system to 2050, if we're going to meet these great targets, how do you fund it? How do you fund a growing and a more equitable system? JMI, my organisation that I lead, we had the privilege of supporting the Accord panel in determining their preferred model for funding. We essentially were redesigning the teaching funding model for higher ed in Australia. So for those of you that want more depth on these issues, if you're really keen to understand more about the ideas around moderated growth targets, needs-based funding, equity loading options, it's all in, well, a lot of it's in chapter 8 of the report, as you'll see, but also the JMI report is being published by the Australian government tomorrow, live on their website. So that's exciting. Go and read more about that. But I don't have time.
It's a good report.
It's a great, thanks, Mary. It was a collaborative effort with the panel to determine their preferred model, but hopefully an interesting report for people to see. Secondly, research. Now, to be tough, the critics on this side said things like, you know, that the research and research funding is notable by its absence. Now, I think that's slightly unfair. Certainly in terms of the government's response, there's limited information or limited statements that they've made thus far on research and research funding. For the Accord, however, it may not have said as much about research as it said about equity and growth, but what it did say was absolutely spot on. Number one, clear commitment to R&D spend, as Mary's outlined. Number two, that research funding needs to follow a pathway to fully funded research, and I'm sure we can add sustainable research funding into there as well. And thirdly, that government utilisation of research to solve real-world problems should significantly increase. Now, of course, I would agree with that. The mission of JMI as an organisation, James Martin Institute, is this joint mission between government and universities to tackle these real world problems. And the energy that I've seen in the last 3 years coming behind this shared mission has just been superb. So it's fantastic to see that reflected in the Accord. The one thing I would say is perhaps the final report slightly underplays the unsustainable research funding situation that we have right now in Australia. Only, as Mary mentioned it, but only 30% of research spend in our universities actually comes from core government funded research. So over 50%, more than half of it, is made up by investment that the universities are having to put in themselves, usually from international student fee income, but also philanthropy and other sources. In the UK, by comparison, that figure is less than 25%. So our universities are having to put more than 50% in. UK universities are still a bit dependent on fee income and other areas, but at less than 25%. So our Australian colleagues quite often look with envy at UK research funding, even if it's not the quantum amount, then the model. There is no QR funding in Australia, no QR funding equivalent. I can say that till I'm blue in the face, but there is no QR funding. So you're just looking at Research Council funding over here with a bit of HDR funding and block funding, but it results in a much higher dependency on international student fee income to fund research. This is well known. Duncan will probably talk about it more eloquently than I am, but it is very well known, but there is no clear solution to this challenge, and it is a really deep-seated challenge. Certainly, there was no clear commitment to changing this over time by the Australian government. As Mary said, in their response, they committed to a strategic review of R&D spend more holistically, but they shied away from perhaps, for example, they may have made a 10-year pathway commitment to more sustainable research funding model or something similar. That was the kind of thing that many people in the sector were hoping for. They haven't done it yet. I'm still hopeful that something on research funding and a longer pathway towards a more sustainable research funding model will be mentioned, but it hasn't quite yet. And sorry, Nick, I'm over time. Just quickly on the ATEC, on the Tertiary Education Commission, it's a little bit like HEPI, but not in the UK mind. This is about the fact that the Accord had this big, bold 10 to 20 year vision. It's not possible in the current institutional structures and capabilities to implement that vision. We've got fragmented policy changes and shifts in government and all of that ad hocery that the UK has experiences all the time as well. So we need a new approach, and this idea of systems stewardship has emerged of the Accord, and there being a responsible systems steward. My passionate plea, and this is my final point, is that this is built around this idea of shared mission that we have started to think about through the Accord. So if we can build on the ambition, the optimism, the expert influence, and the approach and the shared mission partnership model that we've achieved through the Accord, then I think the Australian Tertiary Education Commission is actually the biggest opportunity that's on the table and the biggest game changer for Australian higher education over the next couple of decades.
Brilliant. Thank you, Libby. Again, so much of what you say will be resonating among the UK listeners. But I'm going to go with no further ado. There's lots of questions I'd like to put to you both, but with no further ado, I'm going to go to Duncan, who, of course, has one foot in Australia and one foot increasingly here in the UK as incoming Vice-Chancellor of one of the biggest universities in the UK, Manchester. Duncan, what's your take on the whole process and its relevance?
Oh,
we can hear you.
Hi, Nick. Thanks.
Brilliant.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go. Sorry. Thanks, Nick, and good morning, everyone. Great to be here. So I'll be really brief. And as Nick said, I sort of live in two worlds right now, literally during the day and in the evening. So I'm going to try and come at this as someone who's been in Australia and been involved in this process and this debate for a while, and someone who is coming to the UK very shortly in the next couple of weeks and has been sort of following the UK debate very closely as well. And I think I'll just say three broad things. Both Libby and Mary have touched on both of them. I mean, I think the first thing to say is just to reinforce where Libby started, is that it was an accord, right? I think the language is very evocative. And Australia, until recently, until Mary's team's review, I think has been really ill-served in policy terms. HE policy has been dominated by culture wars, a kind of revolving door of ministers. I think we've had certainly more ministers than the UK has had prime ministers in the last 5 years, which is saying something. and a lot of bad policy ideas. Mary mentioned the Jobs Ready Graduate Bill, which sort of upturned higher education funding for no good reason and hasn't kind of worked. So the fact that we had a new government committed to taking a systematic review of the higher ed system and doing it in, as both Libby and Mary have emphasized, in a very sort of partnership way, was a pretty powerful change in both the tone and the way in which higher education policy was being developed. So I think that's one really important positive message for the UK community to think about, with potentially a new government of one kind or another coming in post July 4th. There are better ways of doing higher education policy, and I think the Australian Accord gives us a great model. And as Libby said, there were really sort of strong anchors and pillars to the policy around equity, skills, and sort of knowledge production and knowledge use. And that really helped structure the debate in the lead up to the final report. So I think the first thing I want to say is that's been an enormously powerful shift in the dialogue, and I think it will have very positive effects downstream. I think the second big lesson for me, reflecting on the Accord and thinking about the UK, coming into the UK, is, I mean, Mary's report, and we'll see if the government goes, how far they go. I think I'm less optimistic than Libby is on this one, I'm afraid, but I mean, it's a systematic response. You know, I think higher education policy has been caught between two worlds, the market and the system, right? The worst version is a weird combination of Thatcherism and Stalinism. And hopefully the Accord gives us a new, more liberal approach, but it definitely comes down on the side of a planned system, right? Better integration between further education, higher education, better integration between research and teaching, better integration between our equity goals and our educational and research goals. So I think this systems, sort of opting for that systems approach, I think is very powerful. It sounds a bit abstract, but I think it's really sending an important signal, and creating the infrastructure for a systems approach to higher education, as Mary has mentioned, the establishment of a new commission, the establishment of various sort of processes for driving change, not just over the next political cycle, but over hopefully the long term, I think is another really important, powerful lesson, or something we can reflect on coming into the UK, into the UK context. So, you know, changing the tone of the debate, taking a partnership approach, opting for that sort of system sort of view of higher ed, I think has been really powerful and important. I think the third thing to reflect on, and Libby touched on this, again, a bit abstract, but what do you expect from a philosopher, is the other thing that the Accord has done is it's really said the massification of higher education is a good thing. Not only is it a good thing, it's a just thing. It's the right thing to do. And the reason why I think it's worth saying that is there is some sort of ambiguity or certain ambivalence in our political system around the massification of higher education, right? On the one hand, Labour and social democratic parties intuitively support it, but don't quite know how to fund it. On the other hand, more conservative parties, both in the center right and further right, are a bit skeptical of massification and hope that the market will solve it. So the fact that the Accord has provided a framework for thinking about what I take to be a just way of dealing with the massification of higher education, to really embrace the massification of higher education as an appropriate public policy goal, is, I think, a really powerful framework for us to think about in the UK. And I think that's a signal feature of the report. The last thing I'll say are the politics are diabolical. The main structural challenge for Australian higher education is research is completely unfunded. And it's not clear to me that the government has really grasped that nettle. And until it does, we face some really significant challenges in Australia. I think the context in the UK is slightly different, but the lack of support for the indirect cost of research is really distorting the funding model for higher education, I think, in both countries, and that's something we're going to have to grapple with.
Brilliant. Thank you, Duncan. I'm going to go straight to Andy. Andy, with your political history, maybe Duncan was putting it over politely about how much skepticism there has been on the right about massification. I don't know if that's something you can touch upon in your comments.
Yeah, well, the politics do feel pretty diabolical here from time to time. But before I dive into that, let me just very quickly say thank you to HEPI and the James Martin Institute for putting today's event on. I think it's I hope this is the first of many joint events, because they're two fantastic organisations, and I love them both. I'm also a big fan of Mary's work. The Accord, I enjoyed every page of it. So just to put that on the table, and finally, you know, thank you for organising the opportunity for me to meet my new boss, which is very much appreciated. I've got three quick things to say, and one kind of word of caution or warning. So let me rattle through them so that we can get into the question and answers. I think the first lesson is actually about process and timing. And I think it's worth us just acknowledging how similar those experiences kind of during the Accord, setting it up, incoming Labour government ahead of kind of big fiscal decisions, how similar those that context is to the one that we find ourselves in the UK. And that will be particularly the case. Obviously, Labour have got to win an election in a few weeks' time. But I think it will be particularly relevant as a process if, as I expect, but this may change, that a kind of a big 3-year spending review will probably take place in about a year's time, probably the autumn of kind of 25. It's very hard to do a huge spending review kind of within a few weeks of entering office. So I think there's a period of time in which you might be able to do something like an Accord. You know, there is potentially almost exactly 13.5 months between now and that point. I think as both Libby and Duncan have mentioned, the opportunity to do something that is collaborative, that builds consensus in a different political climate. As we've all experienced, both in Australia and in the UK, it's been pretty hysterical at times. And to be able to kind of think about these things in that collaborative way, in that kind of deliberately consensus building way, at a point where that is less the case, I think is a real opportunity and an important one for us to take, both for the country as a whole, but for the sector too. The second point I sort of want to dive into really is about purpose and direction of the system. I was listening, as I'm sure many people would have done on the call from the UK, to Paul Johnson speak on a podcast, the Expert Factor podcast recently, saying that kind of even though English higher education is not short of reviews in recent years, many of them have been very technical in their sort of purpose and focus. And what we've been missing is a really big discussion about what it's for. And I think kind of one of the many things that the Accord did so well was kind of take that question on kind of, you know, absolutely head on and boldly on the front foot and kind of set that out. And I think we need that. We need that because a new Labour government will seek to be a different kind of government, a more active government. It's got kind of very clear missions that it wants to enact. It's very clear about wanting to introduce an industrial strategy. So, you know, its expectation is to be a government that wants to pull levers, and in that sort of spatial space, it's very keen on kind of, you know, its good jobs everywhere commitment. So this is a government that, if it's elected, will want to be active and will, I think, need to take the opportunity to sort of think about kind of higher education, tertiary education's kind of role in helping them achieve that. The third, which everybody has touched on, Mary, Libby, and Duncan, and I think the report does really well, is about coherence and stability across what in England is a series of systems. So whether that's higher education, further education, apprenticeships, adult education, and R&D, the current landscape is both incoherent, subject to disconnections, frequent policy change. I think there's a fantastic phrase in the Accord. Someone described the programmatic confetti that has bedeviled the system. Well, we've had that too, and I think kind of a forward-looking process that addresses that incoherence, that addresses that instability, and seeks to do something over the long term is something that we sorely need across the different kind of fragmented parts. Libby, I'm going to add your ad hocery to that confetti point. Another kind of absolutely nailed on insight there. So I think kind of that systems approach that Duncan's described, I think is absolutely critical, and for us to take this opportunity to think about what that means and how we construct it is a really important opportunity that we must take. Which leads me to the kind of the last point, the kind of word of warning or caution. When Mary described the system as you sort of put it, isn't necessarily about fixing broken things. In England, I think it is. There are lots of aspects of the system that are broken and need fixing, whether that's university finances, college finances. Some colleges have been in financial trouble for a decade. Obviously, we know now that a number of universities are in pretty deep financial trouble. We know that student support has kind of hit a brick wall, and that's something that desperately needs fixing. And we know, as is raging in Australia, as we speak, the debate about international students and kind of policy towards them is absolutely sort of critical to all of these issues. So I think kind of because all of those things need urgent attention, it's very hard for an incoming government, or indeed any government, to approach all of those things with the immediacy that you have to, without having a really clear idea of what you want the system to look like and what you want it to achieve in the long term. Because otherwise you're kind of, you're just reacting to particular problems as they hit you. So having an opportunity to kind of work out that long-term mission, purpose, have that collaborative debate, having in a more sensible sort of climate, I think is a way of kind of bringing the future together with the immediate challenge that, or the immediate series of challenges that a new government will inevitably have to face, and face very quickly. And with that, I'll stop.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Andy. I'm going to go with no further ado to the Q&A, because the people who've put in questions, it's like a list of the great and the good of UK HEPI. So we're going to try and turn on their microphone so they can ask their own questions in their own way, unless they're anonymous. And we'll just go through the list, and then we'll go back to the panel. I'd like to do 2 rounds if we can in the 20 minutes. So people will have to be fairly brief, but let's go to Hugh Morris. And Hugh, tell everyone who you are, because not everyone will know. Your microphone is turned on now, I believe.
Yeah, thanks very much, Nick. I'm Hugh Morris. I'm on secondment at the University College London from the Welsh Government, where for the previous 9 years I was the Director of Skills and Higher Education, worked with a range of people on the tertiary reforms there. My question is a simple one about who does what and how do they do that. I was very taken by comments from all the panel members, particularly Duncan talking and Andy talking about the need for a review that involves lots of people. And I was also taken by what Libby and others were saying about the long-term horizons. I'm scared that it will take 10 years to get people out of a market mindset. So I would like to know what the plan might be, given that we haven't had a review, and it's not obvious to me that we have any less fragmented system than is the case in Australia.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go to David now. We're going to take a few questions together. David Lott, tell everyone who you are, David, and please put your question to the panel.
Morning, everybody. David Lott, Deputy Director at University of Scotland. My question was really about, and I suppose everybody on the call, probably the glaring point about the ambition that's been expressed for growing the proportion of the population with a tertiary qualification versus the sort of rhetoric we're getting in the UK, and particularly in this election campaign. In Scotland, to be honest, whilst there's a kind of rhetorical flourish about ambition, sometimes it's a zero-sum game for a declining resource. So how has that played out? I mean, is it just locking on to that joint ambition you described? What were the sort of the key points of consensus or data that secured that commitment?
Brilliant. Thank you, David. Very important question. Ed Bridges, I'm going to go to next. I'm taking the questions in the order that they've been up-voted. So the most popular questions, these are. Ed Bridges. Hopefully we can turn Ed's microphone on. If we can't, I will ask his question. Right, I think he's maybe gone offline or something. So let's ask this question. This review recommended the government should use more university research to address the big issues in Australian society, something the UK arguably ought to be doing too. What in an Australian context do you think are the current barriers to that? And then I'm going to do one more, and then I'd like to do a second round of questions afterwards. So I'm going to go to Micah. Micah Holterbeck, an old friend of ours at HEPI, who is, again, knows the UK and Australia very well. Micah, tell everyone who you are.
Hi, Nick. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the contribution. It's really interesting to listen to. I'm a partner at London Economics. And London Economics, we're a consultancy, economic consultancy based in London, but I'm personally based in Brisbane, so work across both sectors. And we've done a lot of work with Hugh Morris and Nick at HEPI in terms of higher education funding across the UK. So I was particularly interested in the comment and the recommendation you made, Mary, in relation to higher education funding. So you talked about specifically the reversal of the Job Ready Graduates package, which has widely been acknowledged to not have worked, and also in terms of the changes to indexation. Both really interesting comments. I was wondering, given especially the issue in terms of research funding in Australia, but also the caps on international students and sort of the general issues with university deficits, did you look at any potential changes to the system to increase teaching funds as well for universities?
Great. Thank you, Micah. So I'm going to go back to the panel. Brief responses if you can, and don't feel you have to answer every request, because we've got some other brilliant questions I want to put to you as well in a second round. So let's go to Mary and Libby first.
All right. So first to Hugh's question. Hugh, I think market thinking will stay in the system quite a lot. But as to who does what, this is the point about the Higher Education Commission, is that hopefully it will set it, as well as setting policy and setting arrangements, it will set a tone. And we talk a lot about narrative and the importance of talking about what the story is. And I think we have to accept the fact that there will be market mechanisms there supporting that mainline narrow systems thinking that Duncan and Libby emphasised. In terms of David's point, yes, the main issue is the joint ambition, David. It's that the equity student numbers would meet the skills requirements. Strangely enough, the numbers do actually add up. We were very startled when we saw it, and that's when we invented the skills through equity notion. And I don't know if it would happen anywhere else. It just so happens to work on our numbers. Will it work into the future? Not sure. On Ed's point of, I love this one about university government using university research, because the head of Prime Minister, the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, Glyn Davis, has actually started doing that. And as you know, Glyn was for many years Vice-Chancellor of Melbourne, and his research area is public administration, particularly in higher education. So we've got the right person in the right job. And he has already signed an agreement with the Council of the Learned Academies, the 5 learned academies in Australia, about commissioning research for government to solve government problems. What are the problems with it? Largely that governments weren't willing to fund at full rates, but we've recommended full rate funding, and it doesn't seem to be worrying Glyn about finding it. So I think that's a promising area. He's deliberately keeping it relatively quiet, what they're doing, He wants to just let it speak to itself, and I think it will soon. And Micah, there's a lot of questions there about reversing the JRG. Libby might want to, actually probably better if I'll let Libby talk to it. Teaching and the system she constructed for us addresses the teaching problem, teaching and research. Do you want to say a couple of words on it?
Yeah, sure. Just to pick up on that point, I mean, it's an interesting question whether teaching funding ever plays into a balance of reduced research funding. I mean, you get it to cross-subsidy and all those sorts of arguments, but certainly it wasn't a matter of looking at how to increase funding for teaching or unit of funding for teaching. We were looking at how you can fund a sustainable unit of cost or unit of funding for teaching as the system grows. So the Australian system is looking at potentially doubling the number of students to 2050. How do you fund that in a way that is both sustainable and evidence-driven, but also introducing for the first time this concept of needs-based funding? So bringing in evidence and information about what it takes to support equity students through to success, not just to get them in, but to support them through to success through the university system. And so that was the emphasis. And again, as I said, being published tomorrow, so you can have a deep dive into it and give me an email anytime. But I don't think I'll say any more than that on that.
Thanks. Was there one other point you wanted to pick up, Libby?
Yeah, just on the other questions briefly, I really like the second question around, what evidence brought the government to this position around massification and growth. In my view, it's never evidence that does that. Once they have changed their kind of philosophical position and their worldview, they will then pick up the evidence and use it and weave it into their narrative. The evidence has been sitting there for a long time. I think it's a heart debate. It's not a head debate, this issue. We've got to find ways of in the UK shifting the public narrative and the political narrative away from its current position, which I won't comment on, but towards this more optimistic view of, this is for everybody. Nearly everybody needs some kind of post-school education. The economy we want, the future we want for all people right across the country. That's the narrative shift that needs to happen. And then you'll see the data and the evidence just falls into place. But in my experience, it's never evidence-driven because worldviews are too strong. It just bounces off people's existing worldviews. The other point I wanted to make just quickly is about this utilisation of research by government. We've been doing this for 3 years. So the JMI was established by government, working with university partners to find ways to build infrastructure and mechanisms to support academics to work with government on these real world policy challenges. It's a bit different to what Mary was describing because we're trying to do it in a way that provides real-time pragmatic advice into government. We walk alongside our policymakers and our government colleagues and bring academics into that sort of privileged space of really being able to advise and work, collaboratively with their government colleagues. It's been incredible. And the uptake both from our university partners, including University of Sydney, where I'm sat right now, but many others besides, and the government uptake is, we've seen this this desire and this need. The public policy challenges we're trying to tackle are increasingly complex. Whether it's net zero, reducing domestic violence, whatever it is, our social, economic, environmental challenges we're trying to tackle, they're increasingly complex. Government needs support in tackling this issue. We have this incredible base of expertise in our universities, but these two worlds don't often collide very successfully, and they need support. They need brokering, in my experience, to in most cases, to make this work really effectively. So we've been building models of brokering. I know that Andy, through CAPE and other organisations in the UK, are looking at models and ways of doing this that work effectively. But in the UK, there are sort of regional pockets of organisations doing this really well, and I love seeing it bursting up through regional innovation in policy. But there are a few examples, but much more and a much bigger scale of this needs to happen.
And we maybe should, Nick, I just want to come in there. We're helped along this because consulting firms are on the nose in Australia after a couple of scandals.
It doesn't harm us, certainly.
So it doesn't, no, it's quite useful.
Well, it's looking for alternative model, and this is about government harnessing existing public investment in research, right?
That's a very nice segue into Andy, I think. I'm keen to make sure we get a second round of questions in as well, but Andy and then Duncan.
Well, look, I'll only pick a couple of questions, and I think Hugh's point about this needs to be a kind of long-term thing, and I actually quite like, from a sort of government perspective, I quite like the idea that government needs to be honest that there are a series of steps here, a series of fiscal events, and a series of kind of implementation moments, and I think that's the kind of that's the sort of scale of what needs to be done, and it's just a realistic way of thinking about it. I think the kind of the challenge about having a sensible and practical debate about numbers and massification is obviously an important one. It's a vital one, and I think personally kind of the tertiary approach enables us to do that, because it means we can draw the sting out of the kind of us and them, or one sector against another sector, or one type of provision against another type of provision, which bedevils these conversations. So we know in England and to a different extent across the UK that we've got problems from level 3 to level 7. So from that kind of A-level sort of higher technical sort of space through to degrees and postgraduate degrees, and if we think about what we need, and I'm struck by the kind of confidence of the Accord and kind of the way you articulated it, Duncan. This is a good, just, and right thing to do, and I think it is both kind of important and right to think about our system in that sort of tertiary way, because each one of those levels are both important, not just in kind of how we supply them, but how those skills are then utilised in the economy, and how that sort of is reflected in both regional and kind of national economic growth. So I think kind of that tertiary construction allows us to have a more sensible debate about massification and about long-term ambition, and so I think that's very much one that we should copy.
Thanks, Andy. I'm sure David Hughes, who I'm about to go to in the questions, might have thoughts on that. But Duncan, a quick word from you before we go to David and Chris and Claire.
Oh, look, the only thing I wanted to say, again, taking the perspective of someone coming to the UK with the Accord in my back pocket, so to speak. I mean, I think the one thing that we've learned, and Mary and I have some history here, is I think it's really important for government to put a premium on collaboration. I think one thing governments can do is say to universities, work together and we'll back you. And then universities have to respond to that incentive. And good news, we do, right? And I think some of the most exciting developments around mission-based research in Australia have come from governments and universities deciding that they're going to work in a different way, rather than in this transactional one-to-one, global ranking-driven type thing. Actually, it turns out that if you collaborate on big mission-driven issues, it kind of helps your global rankings anyway, but don't tell anyone that. So I think that's one thing that the UK could probably reflect on a bit more, just looking at it from afar.
Great. Thank you, Duncan. I'm very keen to get in some of these fantastic questions we're going in. So can we go to David Hughes, and then we'll go to Chris Husbands, and then we'll follow the list down. David.
Yeah, thanks, Nick.
Tell people who you are, David.
Yeah, David Hughes from the Association of Colleges. I was in Australia a few weeks ago with TAFE directors. TAFE are a bit like FE colleges. And met Barney Roney and lots of other people, the minister's advisors. And the report came at a great time. So great report, great recommendations. I suppose my simple question, I've got 100, but the one I want to focus on is, how confident are you that this really will be about collaboration, Duncan, not just between universities, but between universities and TAFE? Because the TAFE directors I spent 2.5 days with, particularly in a very honest closed session, are deeply sceptical, I think, that TAFE are really even at the table, that the universities are willing to change, that the collaboration between a very competency-based and very narrow vet system with the university system, in terms of the culture shifts that need to happen on both sides, are actually going to happen. And I'm sort of asking for a friend, because it's quite important to us to understand how this might work in the UK.
Thank you, David, very much. You're going to go to Chris Husbands, who's a member of the HEPI Advisory Board, former Vice-Chancellor at Sheffield Hallam. Chris, you had 2 questions, I think, but you might have to choose between them, but what do you want to put?
Right, I'm unmuted. Thanks very much. And Duncan might have slightly spiked the guns on one of my questions, but it's really a question about mission diversification. And I started it in the sense that universities do point at national skill needs and national purpose, but many of them also seek to operate in a global competitive space. And there's been a huge amount of mission homogenization across the higher education sector in the last 20 years. And I'm really interested as to what whether the planning levers to make that different overcome the market levers that drive homogenization and KPIs.
Thank you. And then I'm going to go to Mike Larkin. I'm going to go to Mike, Claire, and then James, and then we'll go back to the panel. Mike, you're on.
Yeah, just unmuting there. I'm actually in a different location on a mobile phone, so I'm struggling with this. Right, this is a fantastic report. I'm Mike Larkin, and I'm a retired emeritus professor of microbial biochemistry from Queen's University, Belfast, but with a big interest in student equality and through total equality for students. And I'm really saying that from what I've seen of this report and what I know about the UK is currently contracting the number of students going to university slowly, and now getting faster if we get a Conservative government coming in. The question is, this is totally at odds with what the Australian philosophy and thinking is. And it's a big question, but a simple question. Why is this? Why is there such a sort of dichotomy between thinking on what is a common issue?
Thank you, Mike. You might have just come up with a theme for the second JMI HEPI webinar. I think we could talk about that for a whole hour. Claire Callender. Claire, tell people who you are. Many people will know, but yeah, put your question to the panel.
Hi, my name is Claire Callender. I'm Professor of Higher Education Studies at the Institute of Education, UCL. So my question picks up on funding issues, and particularly about the student loans. And for us, it's really important to understand what's happening in Australia, because you remain one of the key players in terms of countries that have such a loan system. And my question is, to what extent were issues about rising graduate loan debt, to what extent was that on the agenda? When I read the report, I found very little reference to that, with an emphasis, if anything, on how student loan debt may deter participation, but no serious consideration of how it affects indebted graduates' lives.
Thanks, Claire. And it'll be very interesting to hear what Mary has to say on that. And then final question. I'm sorry if we don't get to your question, but I'm going to go finally to James Robson. Tell people who you are, James, and put your question to the panel.
Thanks, Nick. Hi, everybody. What a fantastic report and session. I'm James Robson. I'm Director of the Centre for Skills, Knowledge and Organisational Performance at Oxford University, and I think one of only 2 people with professorships in tertiary education. So that gives you a sense that I'm very supportive of the ideas of tertiary education. But my question is similar to Chris's, I think. It's about the tensions between pressures towards homogenisation within a market approach and the need for diversity of missions. And it's really about regulation. So at the heart of, I think, the tension between homogenisation and diversification is a prestige economy, which really, really emphasises, I think, research-intensive institutions at the top of this. How do we regulate in a way, in a tertiary system, that really gets to the heart of celebrating a diversity of different missions?
Thank you, James, especially perhaps in a country as obsessed with class and history as we so often are. I'm going to go in reverse order: Duncan, Andy, Libby, Mary. I'm afraid we're meant to be winding up in 4 minutes, so you don't have very long each, but Duncan.
Okay, very quickly. So I think the homogenization diversity question is a doozy, and it's one I'm quite passionate about. I think there's 2 ways you get there. One is, as it were, in a system-driven way, and I think in a purposeful way, and I think that's something that is there in the report, but is probably for elaborating further. And that requires government to work with the tertiary sector to actually provide structural support for institutions to diversify and to focus on different missions. I think that's probably the only way it's going to happen. It's not easy. When you think about the role of a university or a higher education institution in their community, that can be quite tricky. The other way you get there is through, as it were, necessity. And that is, in Australia, we currently cannot fund all the research we're doing in the country. So the only way to get out of that problem is to do less research and to focus that research funding where it can have the greatest impact. Marine science in Northern Queensland, nuclear physics in Sydney or Melbourne or whatever it is. And I'm afraid both of those require some pretty hard political decision-making and very difficult political decision-making. But I think ultimately, diversity of mission of institution through some kind of compact process, to use another good word that is there in Australia but hasn't really been fully developed. We have an accord. Now we can think about compacts between universities and higher education institutions and their communities and government about what their core mission should be, and design a system to support that kind of compact making process. That's a bit of a pipe dream, but I think it's still something worth hanging on to and thinking more about. And I think that's the way you're going to balance this tension between homogenization and diversity. The market will drive homogenization in all kinds, I think, in dysfunctional ways. So there needs to be some systematic policy making to drive that diversification principle. Thank you, Duncan. Andy.
So yes, very quickly, to James and Chris's point, and building on what Duncan's just said, I think, I mean, I think first of all, it is absolutely desirable and essential that we seek to address this and encourage that kind of diversity and stop it sliding into hierarchy, which we so often see in the UK. Just to put my sort of cards on the table, I don't think we can do that with the incentives that currently exist across the system, and I'm not sure we can do it with a series of different market regulators. So I think the answer to this is we need to change the incentives, and we probably need to change the institutions. I think the other sort of point that I'll pick up, I mean, David, you're absolutely right, of course. You know, this is a process that needs to rebuild trust and actively seek to do so between institutions, as well as between all of those institutions and government. And I think, just to finish on Mike's point, we know why this is a debate and a problem, and that is largely about the way people have voted over recent years and kind of the political allegiances that people with different levels of education have voted. So there's a kind of relatively straightforward political science answer to your question, but I think I'd like to flip that and say, you know, one thing we have to hold in our mind as we seek to answer these questions and build a new system in England is about those places and people that don't obviously benefit from these things. If we're going to collaborate properly, we've got to seek answers for those people who, you know, particular political parties in the election might seek to exploit their disagreement with the massification of higher education, or their disagreement with kind of different economic ambitions that spring from it. And we need to kind of hold very, very centrally to any kind of set of reforms a way of making this these changes, these ambitions, kind of speak to their needs as well as to everybody else's.
Thank you, Andy. I feel like channeling my inner Ben Elton by saying a little bit of politics there, which is a very topical way to draw this to a beginning towards an end. So I'm going to go to Libby and Mary for the final word. Libby.
Okay, very, very quick. I think the homogeny question has been covered, and I just would consistently agree with Duncan and Andy on that it's the classic thing of the market, the completely controlled central planning system. We don't want either. We're trying through the accord to develop this idea of stewarded system. And if we can get that right around the compacts, the compact agreements, and also through the funding model, you know, these incentives, these levers that government have. You know, government loves to incentivize certain behaviors and then tell people off for behaving in certain ways. But I think that, you know, we need to be realistic about the incentives and how they operate, and that the Accord's been a process to pause and do that. Very quickly, can I cover Claire's point, because nobody's mentioned it? So I do think this issue of the student loan system is, again, we can have a whole session on this, Claire, and lovely to hear your voice, by the way. I do think, you know, there are interesting parallels, but also some interesting contrasts. Both have the graduate contribution scheme, of course, tick. This is a major advantage for our higher education systems in both countries, and we never want to underappreciate the value of having a well-established graduate contribution scheme in both countries and removing the upfront cost of going to university for students. But yeah, look at the government response. The government response does look at student debt. It's removing some of the cost of living burden for our graduates in terms of their contribution. But there are some, even though it's a similar scheme, there are big differences. We put lower upfront cost, and then nearly all Australians actually pay off their loans in a shorter period of time. UK has a slightly weird approach of putting a very high upfront sticker price and then putting all the subsidies in the back end. So not all of those students are contributing, but the transparency is really poor. So definitely a time to review those options, I think, in the UK, but Australia doesn't have it perfect either. So it's still under review. The Accord was a great chance to reduce the burden of, I'm not going to call it debt, of contributions from graduates through the tax system.
Thank you, Mary.
Just a couple of things from me. I'd love to talk at length about the homogenisation issue. I knew we hadn't completely spelled it out. I felt quite desperate on the second Christmas day of working on the Accord, and knew I had about 3 days to go. So it's still one of those ones that needs some work, but Duncan's answer is the right one, I believe. Just talking about Mike's point, one of the reasons the Australian government is so anxious about getting the skills numbers up is because of low productivity growth in Australia over the last 4 years. And a belief, not maybe fully tested, that the answer, where other answers have been tried, that the answer is more in skills than in innovation, say. And that's one of the reasons why they're very firmly committed to this. And I think that will drive through acceptance of many of the recommendations, is their belief in it. Whether a change of government would do it, I'm not sure. And I'll leave it there, Nick. I could go on about all of those wonderful questions. They were fantastic. And I hope we keep a record of all the questions that came in, because it would be wonderful to see them.
Thank you, Mary. We will indeed keep a record. I'm really sorry, actually, to have to call this really rich conversation to a halt, because I know we could have gone on, but I know people will have other places to go to. We have recorded the session. We'll be up on our YouTube channel later today. I want to end by thanking, obviously, all our fantastic speakers. We're so honoured to be able, particularly Mary, to be able to host you, and Libby with all the work she did feeding into it, and Duncan and Andy, who actually came up with the original idea for this webinar, and I think it's more than proven its value. I also want to thank my colleague Emma at the back end, who's kept it all running very smoothly. And then just very finally to say, do have a look at the HEPI website to engage with what we're doing. Our annual conference is next week. We're going to have Paul Johnson, who was mentioned, talking about the UK fiscal position. We've got Rob Ford, a political scientist from Andy and Duncan's institution, Manchester, talking about the political position. And we'll be launching the Student Academic Experience Survey, which covers many of the issues, biggest survey of its kind in the UK, covers many of the issues that were raised in questions. So I'm going to call it to a halt there. Thank you so much for engaging. I hope, as Andy said, this is not the first time the JMI and HEPI does the last time rather. I hope it's not the last time the JMI and HEPI work together on these issues. And thank you for listening in. Have a good morning if you're in the UK, and evening if you're in Australia. Bye-bye.